Hello and welcome. You've found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Hey there, podcast listeners. Today's episode of the Social Work Podcast is on family therapy for depressed and suicidal youth. I spoke with two of the three developers of attachment-based family therapy, Guy Diamond and Suzanne Levy. The third developer, Gary Diamond, no relationship to Guy Diamond. I know, it's a little odd, but it's true. Gary lives in Israel and was not available for the interview. In 1996, I got my first post-MSW job as a crisis worker for children and adolescents. Now, my job on this team was to assess youth for suicide risk, coordinate with schools, juvenile detention facilities, emergency shelters, residential treatment facilities, hospitals, and provide what we called short-term stabilization therapy. We'd have about 30 days to work with kids and parents and the family as a whole to reduce suicide risk and then set them up for longer-term treatment. Now, the program was set up so that we would do family therapy. The assumption was that working with the family was an essential part of reducing youth suicide risk and getting the youth and family back to their pre-crisis functioning. But despite excellent supervision and on-the-job training, everybody on the team was just sort of flying by the seat of our pants. In 1996, there were no published research studies on how to best work with suicidal youth. There wasn't really much research on what was effective for depressed youth even. David Brent's now classic study comparing cognitive behavioral therapy, family therapy, and supportive therapy for depressed teens wasn't published until 1997, the year after I joined the program. Now, I didn't realize this at the time. I kept asking folks, how do we best work with suicidal youth and their families? And I would get answers like, well, if it seems like the parents aren't so strong, use structural family therapy. Or if the kid seems suicidal because the family doesn't want to deal with their problems, then maybe take a strategic approach. And, that was fine because, like I said, we were just sort of flying by the seat of our pants. But mostly we would just put out one fire at a time. And it wasn't until years later that I realized that we relied on clinical wisdom because that's all there was. Now, I share this with you for two reasons. First, many of you listening are working with populations and problems for which there is mostly clinical wisdom. And if you don't know that's true, then just go ahead and look it up. Find out if there are empirically supported interventions for the population's problems and settings in which you work. And second, you can imagine how excited I was in 2008, a full 12 years after I started that first job as a crisis worker, when I found out that someone had developed a family-based intervention for suicidal youth. Now, I learned this from David Brent, the guy I mentioned a few minutes ago that did that classic study. He told me that Guy Diamond in Philadelphia was doing research on families and suicidal youth. So fast forward to 2012, and I learned that Guy was starting a 5-year clinical trial comparing ABFT to, wait for it, a version of the supportive therapy that David Brent developed for that classic study. So is it nerdy that I think that's cool? Probably. I'm just going to go for it anyway. So I was very excited to do this episode on attachment-based family therapy for several reasons. First, anyone who works with suicidal youth has to consider the family system. I don't care if you're taking a cognitive behavioral perspective, a solution-focused perspective, an attachment perspective. You can't work with kids without considering their family system. And ABFT is an empirically supported treatment that in several research studies has been shown to reduce suicide risk and depression in youth. Second, although there are a bunch of empirically supported family therapies out there like Jim Alexander's functional family therapy, Howard Little's multidimensional family therapy, Scott Hengler's multisystemic therapy, Jose Shapožnik's brief strategic family therapy. They've mostly been evaluated with youth who have substance abuse or juvenile justice involvement. ABFT's focus on depression and suicide risk is a unique contribution to the family therapy universe. Third, in social work education and practice, there's a lot of talk about empirically supported treatments. Some folks love them, some folks don't like them at all. I wanted to talk to the folks on the front lines of developing and testing an empirically supported treatment. And something that isn't in the interview, but that speaks to social work's sense of social and economic justice, is that every time there's a large funded clinical psychotherapy trial, people have access to some of the best therapy in the world for free. So, for example, participants in the ABFT study receive top-notch supervised therapy for 16 weeks and are followed by a research team for a total of a year. So, even if you don't fully buy into empirically supported treatments and that whole milieu, there's real value to the community for having access to the kind of treatments that are really only available during a clinical trial. I was grateful to be able to schedule a time with Dr. Diamond and Dr. Levy because, like I said, they're in the middle of this 5-year clinical trial and they're really busy. In fact, we spoke in one of the therapy rooms where participants are receiving either ABFT, which is the experimental condition, or family-enhanced non-directive supportive therapy, which is the control condition. If you listen closely, you can hear the project staff opening and closing doors, walking up and down the halls, but that shouldn't be too distracting. So in the interview, Guy is going to talk mostly about theory, and Suzanne is going to talk mostly about the practical applications. What do you do in the session as you're moving through these 5 treatment tasks? Before we get to the interview, I'm going to just take a brief moment to provide an overview of the model and then tell you what those 5 treatment tasks are. And I'm doing this so that it'll be easier for you to follow along with the interview. Attachment-based family therapy is intended for kids 12 to 18. It focuses on kids that are depressed and suicidal. The treatment is emotion-focused and client-respectful. It's not client-centered in the sense that attachment-based family therapy comes in with a framework and says, one of the reasons why kids are having a hard time using their family as a resource is because there's been this rupture in the attachment. And by rupture, I mean that there have been these things that have happened that make it hard for the parent to be seen as a resource for the child. So ABFT is typically delivered in 60 to 90-minute sessions. The first task is called the relational reframe. That's the task where, in this one session, the therapist is able to help the family move from seeing the problem as the kid to the solution being the family. Then in task 2 and 3, the therapist works with the teen and the parent separately. So task 2 is called the adolescent alliance task. That's where the therapist works with the adolescent alone to identify more about what these relational ruptures are, and then works with the parents in task 3 and the parent alliance task to figure out what are the stressors and the intergenerational issues that are going on. And task 2 and 3 can happen simultaneously. So you might meet with a family for task 1 on a Wednesday, and then the following week you could meet with the child to do task 2, and then the next hour you could meet with the parent to do task 3. And at that point, then the parent and the child are set up for task 4, which is the attachment task. And this is the task where the parent and the child are able to talk about what gets in the way of the child coming to the parent to talk about issues of depression and suicide risk. And once that has happened in task 4, then the family's ready for task 5, which is what they call autonomy, which is where the therapist supports the parent and the child to talk about how the kid can grow into being the best, safest, healthiest kid that he or she can be. So that's a brief overview. As I said, Guy and Suzanne are going to talk much more about this in detail. So if after listening to this interview, you are as excited about attachment-based family therapy as I was, there are a ton of resources on the Social Work Podcast website, including links to the treatment manual. There is an online webinar, which is free. There is a 3-day training with Guy and Suzanne that's coming up in April of 2015 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where you can meet the developers and they will go through all of the information here in much, much more detail. Again, all these resources are on the Social Work Podcast website, which then links to the Attachment-Based Family Therapy website. And, it's this whole crazy internet thing, which links to everything. And so I'm just going to stop talking and get to the interview. On to episode 96 of the Social Work Podcast, Attachment-Based Family Therapy for Depressed and Suicidal Youth, an interview with Guy Diamond and Suzanne Levy. All right, Guy and Susie, thanks so much for being here on the podcast talking about attachment-based family therapy. So, Guy, attachment-based family therapy is the only treatment that has empirical support for reducing suicidal ideation. And it's a family therapy and it has an attachment focus. Could you talk about why that seems to work?
So let's think a little bit about why family therapy for suicidal teens. Our thinking is sometimes families are chaotic and difficult and people are struggling with things which may contribute to teens feeling suicidal. And sometimes teens are troubled or experiencing bullying or questioning their sexuality and having a lot of inner turmoil, depression, and this can be extremely destabilizing for families. So even the best families, when faced with a kid struggling with suicide, can be pretty disrupted and under a lot of distress. So for us to approach this population with the family in mind allows us to try to improve the context of this adolescent's life. If the family's a problem for that adolescent, we want to try to tinker with it. If the family's been overwhelmed and unavailable to provide the support that the adolescent needs, we want to try to tinker with it. And our experience is trying to affect the context of an adolescent's life helps reduce some of the stress, reduces some of the difficulties that get in the way of the adolescent using the parents for comfort, security, and protection. And this is sort of what leads us to an attachment framework. A lot of the old theoretical models of cybernetics or general systems theory and even some of the narrative therapy models for me don't provide a language and a theoretical framework for what am I doing in the room, what am I trying to facilitate, what am I trying to build on. I think attachment theory also comes out of developmental psychology and really has a deeper, both empirical and clinical understanding of the role that the family context plays in facilitating adolescent development, child development. And I think that is a very potent set of ideas for family therapists to be thinking about. In many ways, what we are trying to do is recalibrate a family to be the cauldron, the context where kids can grow up and learn to trust themselves and learn how to manage their emotions and learn how to trust in other people and learn to feel worthy of being loved and capable of loving. And it all happens in the context of the family. In that regard, I think our model, and as you'll hear from myself and Suzanne, it's a very strength-based model. It's about helping parents be empowered to provide the kind of context we know is needed for healthy child development. So it's not a blame the parent, it's not that you did something wrong, it's that we think if we can help you resuscitate some of the skills and capacity and patience to help these kids, that it'll create the greatest opportunity for kids to grow and settle in and become who they're capable of being. So attachment theory provides a lot of that framework. It's a lot about parental sensitivity, a balance of structure and love. It's a lot about kids' emotional development and their regulation and their ability to trust in the world. And we are trying to repair some of that so that a child can really have a secure attachment base and parents can provide the intimate and protective parenting structure that we think is healthy for kids.
You know, a lot of the families that I've worked with, I know that a lot of folks work with out in the field, that the parents desperately want to be doing the right thing. And it sounds like you are offering a way for parents to either think about what's going on with their kids or to be with their kids in a way that they can do what they want to do, but for whatever reason they can't. And I know that there are 5 tasks for ABFT. Could you talk about what happens in the first task?
Yeah. Let me just say something about the tasks in general and then a little bit of the content of them. So, again, we are guided by a theoretical and empirical framework about child and family development. We use these ideas to organize what we think should be happening in a family and what it takes, particularly for a lot of our kids with trauma, what kind of optimal family context it takes to help a kid move through and resolve some trauma experiences. And in that regard, the model provides a lot of guidance and structure to it. It's a very depth-oriented, emotion-focused, experiential process in the room, but for the therapist, there's a clear framework of what am I focused on, what am I trying to accomplish, and what are some of the steps I can do to get there. And because of that, the therapist has a much higher level of intentionality than happens in some models, and that allows them to get to some pretty profound primary emotional interpersonal processes fairly rapidly in the treatment. So by 10 weeks, we're clearly into the middle of some of the biggest themes that drive some of the pain in this family, partly because of the 5 tasks that allows us to get there. So what are the tasks? It really is a kind of stage-specific model. It's not overly rigid. It's not a prescriptive recipe. If people deviate or find different things or have to go down a different road for a while, that's, permissible. It is a treatment manual, but it's a fairly flexible and principle-driven manual. So for us, the tasks organize what we think are the critical steps of therapy. And for our work, and maybe for any family therapist, really initial model of the therapy is getting the family to buy into doing family therapy. Why am I here? My kid's got the problem. I'll sit in the waiting room. And I think all of us as family therapists sort of have to help the family understand, why do the parents need to be in the room? What's their role? What's their potential contribution? And for us, we know that's a critical challenge to get negotiated, so we take it on very intently in the first session and try to make it the focus of our work. So for us, the primary goal of the first session is what we call the relational reframe. And it's not about reframing the problem, it's about reframing the goals of the therapy. You've come here because you want us to fix your kid. We want you here because we think if we can help the family improve, that the kid will have a much better chance at improving as well. So we're trying to win them over to a more systemic family frame on what therapy could look like, at least as the initial phase of therapy. And for us, it has to do with, again, from an attachment point of view, rebuilding trust. Why doesn't your son come to you when he's up in his room feeling suicidal? What's gotten in the way of him seeing you as his natural, instinctual context for safety and protection? And we want to try to figure out what kinds of things have ruptured that trust, have gotten in the way of that trust, so that we can try to resolve those things so that once again your son can see you as someone who's trustworthy, that they can turn to, that they expect the parent will be there, and the next time I feel suicidal, I'm going to go to you instead of taking pills.
So, Susie, what are some examples of ruptures?
So we really think about ruptures in a few different ways. They can be small, like attachment injuries, or they can be larger, like traumas. And so when we talk about attachment ruptures, we usually talk about little T's and big T's. So something that a little T could be is just feeling like, you go to talk to your parent and they just don't get you. They don't understand. They consistently ask why and don't really get it, or they criticize you when you go to them, or disagree with you, maybe completely invalidate validate what you're saying. So that might be like a little T. A bigger T would obviously be like things like parents' own psychopathology. So you have a parent who's depressed or using substances, and so that makes them unavailable to you. When you try to go to them, mom's depressed, she's going through her own stuff, I can't burden her, put more on her, or it's just going to make her sadder. And then we have our larger T's, which are, what you'd really consider traumas. So abuse, whether it be physical, emotional, sexual abuse, neglect, abandonment. And so we certainly have families in which, maybe the family still is somewhat intact, but emotionally the kid has felt abandoned, or something has happened that every time they do something wrong, they're shipped off to another relative's house and not kept part of that primary family.
And it makes a lot of sense that those would be, the ruptures, the things that would keep the kid from going to the parents. Is that what you guys do in task one? Like you figure out all of those, and if you do, how does that then make the parents and the kids want to keep working together on this issue? Yeah,
it's a big question to ask, right? So we don't necessarily get at all of them in task one. Really what we're trying to do in task one is establish the fact that this adolescent isn't going to their parent for help. And so what we find often in task one, maybe those little T's will come out. Oh, I feel like my parent doesn't understand me, or they just don't get it, or I feel uncomfortable going to them. And really in task one, we're not looking to solve any of these ruptures. If some of them come out, great. And we're just trying to establish this kid isn't going to their parent, and that's having dire consequences for everybody in the family. And we use that to help motivate the family to say, we want to work on a relationship, and we want to figure out why our child isn't coming to us for help and support when they're feeling horrible.
So after everybody's on board with this idea that they should be there as a family, what's the rationale behind saying, hey, you guys need to be here as a family, and then working with individuals in the second and third task?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So many people who've studied family therapy have seen the old Minuchin tapes, and they're training tapes, so they're a little contrived context, but essentially the old structural model used to be turn to each other and do something different. The enactment, which we believe in. We think the enactment, the experiential event in the room of being different with each other, is an important therapeutic action. The problem with the old models is you would say, okay, Johnny, turn to your mom and tell him how you feel. And Johnny doesn't know much more about how he feels. He hasn't articulated that feeling. He doesn't feel safer about it. He doesn't feel the therapist is on his side. You're going to have him start talking to the mom. The mom's not prepared. She's going to do the same old thing she usually does and criticize or get defensive. And so we, in our model, think a lot about preparation and take a lot of time meeting alone with the kid in task 2, and then alone with the parents in task 3, and in a very thoughtful, tempered way think through all the things that we think we need to do in order to get them ready to have a different kind of conversation. So in task 2, the essence of it is to help the child be able to more deeply and honestly and emotionally articulate some of the kinds of ruptures that have gotten in the way of trusting their parents. We think a lot of kids know what these things are, but usually they express them through temper tantrums or behavior problems, and they never come out directly out of the box and say, look, Mom, this is what hurt my feelings or bothers me when you do this. And we're not trying to encourage them to blame his parents, but we are trying to coach them to be more articulate, more direct, more honest, to feel entitled that they can express their concerns about hurts and injustices that they've felt. So that's really the goal of task 2, to help the kid understand his attachment rupture narrative as we talk about it, and then get them to be willing to talk to their parents about it in the future of task 4.
So what specifically happens in task 2?
Well, so first, obviously, we want to really get to know the adolescent and join with them. We want to have them see us as somebody who's there to be supportive and caring and who is going to really listen to their story. Because we feel like for a lot of these adolescents, they're not even sure of their own story, and they certainly haven't had anybody who's listened to it in a supportive way. So we do kind of the normal things of joining to begin with, just understanding who they are, what they like. We're also taking note of kind of what are the defenses that they have, and not necessarily naming them in this moment, but we're going to bring them up later on. And then just trying to explore their worlds a little bit more, who their friends are, what their relationships have been like in their friends, how's school going. And then we also really want to get a better picture of their depression or suicide narrative and really understand kind of what is causing their distress, how long has this been going on, what do they think about it, what does it mean for them, and what are the ways in which it affects them. So how is it impacting their life on a day-to-day basis? And once we have that, we also might then be pointing out places that they have defenses. We might notice that they shut down as soon as they start talking about something emotional. They're a kid who shuts down. Or they're a kid who, when they start talking about something emotional, they get completely dysregulated and can't contain themselves. And so working with those defenses, helping them take note of them. And then what we try to do is try to understand, so all of these horrible things are going on in their life. They're depressed, they're having thoughts about suicide, but we know they're not reaching out to their parents. And that reaching out to the parents takes trust. And so we kind of revisit those ruptures that we might have tapped into a little bit in task 1. And now we want to fully get the attachment narrative. So we want to understand all of the ways in which the relationship has unfolded with their parents. So what are the times that they really needed their caregiver and their caregiver failed to be there for them in a way that was helpful? And we're going to try to get at different episodic memories and really understand what that meant for the adolescent, how they felt at that time, how that's affected them. We bring in attachment themes, so kind of common themes we hear are abandonment, neglect, rejection, feeling uncared for, and really try to help the adolescent make a more coherent story about what's happened to them in their relationship with their parent, and then how that's affected them more broadly. And then we tie that back to the depression and suicide, and we use that as a motivator to get them to want to talk to their parents about these things. And so, when, like I said in the beginning, sometimes for these kids, their parents are a direct cause of their depression, or they're one of the reasons that they're depressed. They fight all the time, or parents have done things in the past that have been really upsetting. But other times it's not. These kids are depressed for reasons that are unrelated to their parents, but they're unable to talk to them because they feel like their parent criticizes them or judges them. And so we're tying these pieces together and then helping the adolescent see that the way to move past that depression and suicide feelings is to repair that relationship with their parent and the benefits of doing that for them.
So what happens in task 3 when you're meeting with the parents?
So the goal with the parents is a complicated one. I think we all who work with families know that parents bring a lot of history, a lot of their own challenges, marital problems, depression. A lot of parents are great and committed and just lost and don't know what to do. I mean, there's a whole range of what we get. The ultimate goal is to activate and enhance their caregiving instinct. The part of them that does care about their kid, that wants to help their kid. Many of our parents feel that way coming in. Given how much you love your kid, how much you want to be for him, it must break your heart that he doesn't come to you when he's in trouble. And we try to activate the acknowledgement in parents that, as much as I love my kid and mean well by my kid, something's not working. I'm not being able to be the kind of parent for him that I want. He's not coming to me in the ways I want. And if we can sort of activate that desire in parents to want to be more available, we then actually can coach them on some very particular skills we think are important that would allow the kid to turn to the mom more and trust the mom more. In that regard, we're trying to prepare for the attachment task. We know the kid is going to come to the table and sort of get these things off their chest, and we want the parent, it's a tall order, it's a high bar for parents, but we want them to be able to listen, not defend, not criticize, but really focus on the child and help the child tell their story. We sort of sell it to parents as, part of the reason they turn to suicide is because they're so internally confused that they turn to self-harm instead of being able to articulate the things that have bothered them. If you could be there and be sort of a witness and be able to be available and help them articulate these things, it's actually a learning experience for the kid. And this is a new way that you could help him learn about himself, articulate feelings, and speak up for himself and seek help in ways that are more productive than self-harm.
So this task with the parents is really like, I recognize you're under a lot of stress. It's difficult having a suicidal kid, their financial pressures, and that's really how you break down their defenses and build a rapport and relationship with them, right?
Yeah, well, that's one of the ways that we do that. Another thing that for us is really important in ABFT is looking at parents' own intergenerational history of attachment. So we're not necessarily going to go and do their entire history and do a huge genogram, but we really take usually about a session, maybe not always an entire session, but we're looking to see parents' own experiences of being taken care of by their caregivers. And what we find often is, we're going in to listen for parents' own history, finding moments when they needed their parents, when their attachment instinct was activated, and looking to see how their caregivers responded and how that affected them. And what we find is, in going into these stories with parents, that their stories are really similar to their adolescent stories. That I mentioned, earlier, and when we were talking about task 1 and some ruptures that you could have, I worked with an adolescent whose rupture was every time her and her mom got into a fight, mom shipped her off to grandma's house. This girl really felt abandoned by mom. And what we found is, in going into mom's story, that mom had several instances of being abandoned. When she was younger, her mom kind of took her stepfather's word over hers about sexual abuse and kicked her out of the house. Her father abandoned her and wouldn't let her into his house. She went to a group home, and the caretakers there abandoned her. And so just time and time again, this theme of abandonment. And while that looks drastically different from her daughter's experience, the feelings were the same. And so just like we do with current stressors, we try to stay with the parent's story and really hear their story and empathize with them and validate their experience and have them feel taken care of. And we want the parents to resonate with their own story emotionally and feel some empathy for themselves. And once they've done that, once you see this emotional connection to their own story, then we help parents think about how is their story similar to what their adolescent might be experiencing.
It's so interesting that you say that, because I think one of the experiences that service providers run across is sort of these cycles, right? There might be the cycle of poverty or cycle of abuse or cycle of addiction or some sort of thing. And what you're saying is that you hear something from the kid, then you hear it from the parent. But what do you say to get the parent to realize, oh, I'm doing to my kid what my parent did to me?
Yeah. So I think you have to kind of couch it in what's appropriate. So in this example of abandonment, I was really able to say to the parent, you have had all these experiences of being abandoned. And throughout mom's story, I was weaving in the word abandonment, and that really resonated with mom. And talking about how that impacted this mom, and how despite all of this abandonment, mom was able to move on in her life and was in school, getting a degree, and then just bringing in the adolescent and saying, but I wonder, I know you and your daughter have a lot of conflict sometimes, and that when this conflict happens, that you take her to grandma's house to take care of until things cool down. And I wonder, I know it's on such a different scale, but I wonder in those moments that you take your daughter to grandma's house, I wonder in those moments if she feels abandoned like you did, even though the scenarios are so different and you're not really abandoning her. I wonder in those moments if maybe it feels like abandonment to your daughter. And so really kind of pointing out, we recognize these situations are really different, but the emotionality underneath it might be the same.
I could see how that would be incredibly powerful for a parent, especially the way you said it. It wasn't blaming, it wasn't judging, it was, do you think it's possible that your daughter might be feeling the same way, even though you don't mean it that way?
Yeah, it's the difference between intention and effect, right? I mean, mom's intention is to take care of the child in that moment and provide safety, but the effect is the exact opposite, that what the girl feels is mom isn't protecting me, I can't trust her with my feelings, she can't handle me.
A lot of the work is us connecting with parents so they trust us more. The most common pathway is you had nobody to turn to when you were a kid. How would you like to be able to be that for your child now? So we try to use some intergenerational history and understanding to activate their parental instinct, their caregiving instinct. We then teach them some skills about active listening and emotional focused parenting skills, and then when we sort of feel confident enough, both in the sessions alone with the child and alone with the parent, we feel it's good enough. It's not always perfect, but sometimes it's good enough. We say, okay, we're going to head into task 4 and try to really slug through some of these more core attachment traumas that have happened in this family.
So there's really been so much preparation leading up to task 4. What happens in task 4? It sounds pretty important.
Yeah, so, we go back and forth ourselves. How therapeutic is task 2 and 3 in and of itself? Or is it really just preparation for task 4? And that varies case by case. Sometimes you do some pretty profound work with parents or kids alone in those tasks, but you're always in your mind thinking, how is this going to help me get ready for the conversation I want them to have? We really, coming out of structural family therapy, believe in enactment. We believe in experiential change, that people in the room could have an experience of each other, a more positive experience that would actually affect the way they think about themselves. So what we want is the kid who started therapy saying, my mom won't listen to me, she doesn't care how I feel, I can't talk about myself, comes into this experience and comes out feeling like, oh my God, my mom really was there for me and could really listen, and I didn't have a temper tantrum, and maybe I could expect that she will be there for me, and maybe I can articulate the things that are on my mind. So that's our goal of the task. The overall structure is mom and dad say, look, there's been a lot that's going on in our family, and sometimes we haven't heard how you feel about it enough. Today's the day. We're here. We're ready to listen. We want to know what's going on. Whatever you want to say, we want to hear you out. And that creates a little bit of safety and context, and ideally what happens is the kid starts to talk and basically says, all right, look, there has been some things that have upset me. When you two divorced and I felt like I was stuck in the middle of it. When you two, when mom went to the hospital and I didn't know why and no one explained it. And when I was being bullied in school and nobody protected me. And the child begins to tell these often quite profound stories of danger, of feeling threatened, of feeling abandoned, of feeling alone, of feeling sad. And they learn how to put all these feelings into words. They learn that they can tell these stories more coherently. And ideally what happens, the parents provide the sort of optimal parental environment of love and protection and safety. And we really think about this as a corrective attachment experience. The attachment framework is really when a child is young and feels threatened, the attachment is, I need help, I need comfort, and that behavioral system gets activated and they go seeking their parent and grab onto mom's dress or climb in dad's lap and seek out comfort. And these episodes for us are sort of a reenactment of that the kid finally comes to the table and says, look, I know I've been acting mad and throwing things, but the truth is I'm really sad and I'm really upset and I feel confused and I feel lost. And parents provide a lap and say, come here, Johnny, tell me how you feel. We're going to be here for you. So that this attachment rupture conversation gives the child a chance to turn to their parents again and find out they're trustworthy, and gives the parents a chance to be the kind of parent that the kid really felt like he needed during these times of high threat and high emotional need. The conversation goes on. It can be quite complex. It can last for multiple sessions. There may be multiple topics to talk about, but the goal is that it's sort of an honest, emotional encounter with each other where people feel safe to tell the truth and feel able to better understand the stories of their lives without feeling afraid or overprotective and threatened. It definitely tends towards helping the child talk about their side of it. We're not there to have mom talk about her depression too much or her alcohol problem or the marital violence. There might be some of that. Some of these kids know a lot about it but have never heard about it. We know kids who've grown up with bipolar parents and have been victim of a lot of chaos because of that, and no one's ever told them mom's bipolar and given them some framework of how to understand that and what does that mean, and it's not me. So there is an element of this where parents might tell some of their story and help the kid understand it, but it's really the focus, the goal is helping this suicidal kid find a better way to put the story of their life together and start to feel like I can turn to my parents, they can listen to me, I can't expect them to be available when I need it.
So this sounds like a really lofty goal. I mean, repairing attachment ruptures. How do you do that?
Yeah. So this really comes off of what we've done in tasks 2 and 3. We've worked hard to prepare both the parents and kids to come to talk about these issues, but we know it's going to be difficult. Even you can do all the prep work in the world, but these families are used to talking to one another in a certain way. We've talked with the adolescent and the parents about what are they worried is going to happen in this session, what are their fears, and we've prepared around how do we make sure that their fears, if they do happen, how do we protect them? And the adolescent is ready. They know what they're going to talk about because we prepared that. And we really start them out by having the adolescent turn to the parent and start talking about why it's difficult for them to go to the parent. As the therapist, I'm looking to see how is each person reacting, and I'm in it with them. I'm going to let conversation go on when it's going well, but I'm also really making an attempt to make this conversation go different. So I'm going to be working hard to coach both the parents and the adolescent to make this that corrective attachment experience. If the kid is having difficulty articulating what they're thinking, feeling, I know what it is because we've already talked about it in task 2. So I'm going to prompt them or get the parents to ask questions that would prompt them by coaching the parents. If the parents, their immediate reaction is to get defensive and fall back into that normal style that the kid was afraid of, I'm going to address the parents and help realign them. Maybe I'm going to remind them of the things we talked about in task 3 or their own attachment history to get them in that right emotional space. I might prompt them for the types of questions they should ask. And this whole time I'm having these conversations go between the parents and kids. I want to be out of it. I don't want them talking to me because that's going to decrease emotionality. So I'm working hard to make sure the conversation is going well, but still between the parent and adolescent. So you might, in a family that's going to struggle more, do a lot of coaching the kid, coaching the parent to get this to be a really corrective attachment experience.
So tasks 1, 2, and 3, lead up to this conversation, which you described as like a corrective attachment experience. So assuming that this works and the kid feels comfortable or secure in the knowledge that I can go to my parents, you have a 5th task. So like what's left to do after the secure base has been reestablished? Like what do you do in task 5?
Yeah. So that's a great question, and the way we think about the progression is we know from today's developmental research that kids who feel both connected, feel attached to their parents, but also can negotiate and explore autonomy are the most healthy, well-adjusted kids. That the balance of attachment and autonomy is the formula for healthy adolescent development, not separation, individuation, or storm and stress, and those models are not how we think about adolescence anymore. So for us, we feel like our first goal, the task 1, 2, 3, 4, is to reestablish, recalibrate, repair, refurbish the attachment security so that can once again be in place. And, we accomplish what we can. We try to be realistic. We do have profound conversations where people really make shifts in how they view each other and their relationships. But with that foundation set, we now think about, okay, we now have secure attachment. Now we have to help promote autonomy. And the goal is, with the secure base in place, the family can once again be a cauldron to promote, challenge, encourage, support the adolescent in starting to grow up, getting back to school, getting a job, going out with friends again. Some of it's sort of functional things they have to get back to. Sometimes there's then discussions related to identity development that can occur. A lot of our teens we work with are sort of questioning their sexuality, and once there's enough attachment security, we find a lot of these teens actually want to use their families as a place to explore this and understand it, or at least get support from it. So there might be questions like that. We talk sometimes about racism and ethnicity and how do those things impact who I am and who I'm going to be, and that the child has a place to turn to explore things about themselves, experiences in the world, and the family continues to provide a secure base to allow them the foundation so they can do that exploration. So Task 5 is really about helping the child re-engage in their life. A lot of our suicidal depressed teens have fallen off the wagon. They're not in school. They've lost friends. They've been in and out of hospitals. And so we're sort of reconstructing a life for them, and Task 5 begins to focus on that. There's sometimes not a clean boundary between Task 4 and 5, and we go back and forth. We got to pick up a few themes, but we are thinking in this relatively brief therapy. It's before we're done, I want to make sure he's back in school, feeling that mom and dad have worked out a more reasonable expectation of chores and duties and restrictions and curfew, and that we sort of work on normative adolescent things. And that this is Bowlby thinks of it as a goal-corrected partnership, that a parent and an adolescent, it's not that the child's an infant and the parent has to take care of them. Now the child has a voice and should have input in negotiating how things go for their life. Not that they're in charge. We don't want parents to think that, but they need to be more of a participant at the table if they're going to feel that their independence and emerging adulthood is being honored. And certainly as a kid gets older, that becomes even more important. And so we help the family sort of renegotiate some of the daily livings of life.
So, Guy, the way that you're describing Task 5 is what I think of as family therapy. Like, if I were to describe what family therapy is, in a general sense, I would describe what you just described as Task 5.
And that's how we think about it also. I mean, we give our workshops, we talk about the fact that Task 5 is going to look like more general family therapy. The difference, though, is that it's built on this now having repaired these injuries between the adolescent and parent. That for a lot of these topics you talk about in Task 5, if there isn't trust and a feeling of safety, kids aren't going to open up to their parents about these issues. So we really look at, you need to have Task 4 where you're repairing that trust and safety and protection in order to do Task 5.
What's an example of that?
Yeah, so an example would be, I worked with a client who was gay. It was known in the family that he was gay. And the parents, on the one hand, would say they were really accepting of that, but then they would do these things that we call microaggressions. For example, the kid would come downstairs in tight jeans, and the parents would say things like, "Are you really going to wear that outside? Because that kind of makes you look like you're gay." But 5 minutes before, they were saying, "We don't care who you are or who you're attracted to. That doesn't matter to us." So these are conflicting behaviors. So for this adolescent, that was a really big rupture for this kid. That was one of the things he wanted to talk to his dad about in Task 4 of, you say these things on the one hand that you are okay with me, but then you do these things that show me you're not. And how can I trust you because you're inconsistent? And so we really needed to talk about that in Task 4 so that then we could talk about issues that he was struggling with around being gay in Task 5. So this was a kid who was deeply religious. And he was struggling with the fact that he was gay and his religion says that that's not okay. And how do you kind of bring those two things together? And he could never have trusted in his father to discuss that with his dad prior to having this conversation in task 4 about the microaggressions, because it wouldn't have been safe. But now that they've worked through those issues, and dad didn't even realize he was doing those things, and they were able to talk about it and trust has been repaired, he was able to have these really deep conversations with his dad in task 5 about their religion and about him being gay. And how do you still be who you are and still be religious and bring those things closer together.
Guy and Susie, thank you so much for being here on the podcast and for talking about attachment-based family therapy.
Thank you for having us here.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Really great to be here, and we love your work, so we're honored to be on your show.
I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.